are not what they seem. Check the motivation and the intention they bring. Things are not what they seem. Check the money trail if you know what I mean. 100 years has passed since the passage of this act to benefit themselves with this quasi-contract. Slip the bill through in the middle of the night.
From public law to public policy, the 1938 Transformation in U.S. Legal, Monetary, and Administrative Frameworks Introduction. In 1938, the U.S. Supreme Court rendered a decision in Erie Railroad Cove, Tompkins, fundamentally altering the application of federal common law in the American legal system. This shift marked the beginning of an era characterized by an emphasis on statutory public policy rather than broad principles of public law. Concurrently, changes in the U.S. monetary system and the rise of the administrative state further redefined the functions of government, courts, and federal agencies. These changes collectively laid the foundation for a modern regulatory state, influencing the judicial approach to public policy statutes over the next century. The Erie Doctrine and the End of Federal Common Law. The Erie decision abolished the application of federal common law in diversity jurisdiction cases, a move that courts, practitioners, and scholars consider pivotal in the development of American jurisprudence. Before 1938, federal courts operated under the doctrine established by Swift-Tyson, allowing federal courts to apply a federal common law derived from general principles rather than adhering to individual state laws in diversity cases. This practice ensured a degree of uniformity across federal rulings, reinforcing the role of federal courts as interpreters of a unified legal standard. However, the Erie decision reversed this doctrine, holding that there is no federal general common law, thereby requiring federal courts to apply state laws in cases where federal law was not controlling. Justice Louis Brandeis, writing for the majority, asserted that the reliance on federal common law violated principles of federalism and separation of powers, noting that courts were encroaching upon the legislative prerogative of state governments. By requiring federal courts to apply state laws, Erie effectively limited judicial discretion in favor of statutory and policy-driven interpretations. This shift laid the groundwork for courts to increasingly view cases through the lens of public policy statutes rather than traditional public law principles, aligning judicial interpretation with legislative intent in a manner that echoed the regulatory priorities of the era. The rise of the administrative state and public policy statutes. The Erie decision occurred amidst the sweeping New Deal reforms under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This period marked a dramatic expansion of federal regulatory authority and gave rise to what some scholars refer to as the administrative state. The New Deal created an array of regulatory agencies empowered to enforce public policy goals in areas such as banking, agriculture, labor, and welfare, moving the focus of federal oversight from foundational legal principles to statutes designed to achieve targeted policy outcomes. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which established the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, exemplify this shift. These acts empowered the SEC to regulate financial markets with enforcement and interpretation mechanisms rooted in the agency's specialized knowledge, thereby transferring some traditional judicial interpretive roles to regulatory bodies. 4. Public policy statutes enforced by these agencies reflected the priorities of the New Deal, emphasizing social welfare and economic stabilization over foundational legal doctrines. The abandonment of the gold standard and the move to fiat currency. Around the same period, the U.S. undertook significant changes in its monetary framework, further impacting the nature of legal interpretation and contractual obligations. In response to the economic pressures of the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration enacted the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, severing the U.S. dollar's link to gold and granting the Federal Reserve broader control over the money supply. By 1934, the Gold Reserve Act required nearly all private gold holdings to be transferred to the U.S. Treasury, effectively ending the gold standard for domestic transactions and establishing the dollar as a fiat currency, backed solely by government decree. The legal consequences of this shift were profound, as contract obligations denominated in gold or gold equivalents were now to be interpreted based on government-issued currency values. The courts faced the challenge of reinterpreting private and public contracts, reinforcing the government's ability to manage economic recovery through monetary policy. 6. In effect, the transition to fiat currency represented another move from traditional public law toward statutory frameworks based on economic policy objectives. Judicial deference to public policy and regulatory agencies. The rise of public policy statutes and the expansion of administrative agencies necessitated a judicial shift in approach. Post-Erie, courts increasingly deferred to the expertise of regulatory agencies in interpreting statutes and enforcing policies, particularly in complex or specialized fields. This deference was codified in the 1944 case Skidmore v. Swift & Co., which established the principle that courts should give weight to agency interpretations based on their expertise, even when not binding. 7. This shift reflected the evolving role of the judiciary, which began to view cases less as matters of legal principle and more as issues of public policy. Courts applied statutory law with an eye toward the regulatory objectives underpinning these statutes, rather than solely relying on traditional public law doctrines. As a result, legal analysis in many areas became focused on regulatory compliance, with courts interpreting statutes in line with public policy goals established by the legislative and executive branches. Conclusion: the events of 1938 represent a pivotal point in American legal, monetary, and administrative frameworks. The Erie decision ended the federal courts' reliance on a unified federal common law, directing them instead to apply state law and defer to legislative intent. Simultaneously, the abandonment of the gold standard allowed for flexible monetary policy, which in turn redefined economic obligations under a fiat system. These legal and monetary shifts enabled the rise of the administrative state, transforming the role of federal courts and reinforcing the importance of public policy statutes over foundational principles of public law. Today, these developments continue to shape the landscape of American law, influencing how statutes are interpreted, policies are enforced, and public interests are balanced. Footnotes. Footnotes 1. Erie Railroad Co. v. Tompkins, 304 U.S. 64, 78, 1938. 2. I bid, 78-80. 3. See Cass R. Sunstein, After the Rights Revolution, Reconceiving the Regulatory State, Harvard University Press, 1990, 21. See Securities Act of 1933, 15 U.S.C. Par 77A, Securities Exchange Act of 1934, 15 U.S.C. Par 78A. 5. Emergency Banking Act, Pub L No. 73-1, 48 Stata 1, 1933. 6. Norman v. Baltimore and Ohio Arco, 294 U.S. 240, 303, 1935. 7. Skidmore v. Swift & Cody, 23 U.S. 130, 40, 1944.
Slip the bill through in the middle of the night to overthrow the people's sovereign rights. Things are not what they seem. Check the motivation and the intention they bring. Things are not what they seem. Check the money trail if you know what I mean. They stole the Constitution so they could steal the gold. The issuance of the currency was what they're going for. They buy the politicians and create a bunch of wars. They make the people believe to make the old land secure. Things are not what they seem. Check the motivation and the intention they bring. Things are not what they seem. Check the money trail if you know what I mean.